Welcome. We are about to explore one of the most profound structural shifts in global economic history, the rapid ascent and catastrophic collapse of the German imperial economy between 1871 and 1918. In less than half a century, Germany transformed from a fragmented patchwork of agrarian states into the industrial, technological, and scientific hegemon of continental Europe. By 1913, the German Empire possessed the third largest economy in the world, directly challenging the long-standing supremacy of Great Britain. But this economic miracle was not merely the result of fortuitous natural resources. It was a meticulously engineered architecture, a German model forged by a unique synthesis of visionary economic theory, pragmatic statecraft, and aggressive industrial integration. To understand how Germany built this economic juggernaut, we must first look back to the early 19th century, long before political unification, to a man who provided the theoretical blueprint for it all, Friedrich List. List was an economist, diplomat, and the prophet of national integration. While classical British economists like Adam Smith preached the universal gospel of free trade, List and the subsequent German historical school of economics argued that such policies only benefited nations that were already dominant. In his 1841 masterpiece, The National System of Political Economy, List posited that a nation's true wealth lay not in its current accumulation of goods, but in developing its future productive powers. List argued that late developing nations like Germany required infant industry protection, temporary tariffs that would shield nascent domestic factories from advanced British competition until they were strong enough to compete globally. Crucially, List championed the Zollverein, or customs union, established in 1834, which demolished the internal tariffs paralyzing the German states. To List, overcoming internal customs barriers and building a vast national railway network were the Siamese twins of German development, laying the economic tracks for a unified political state. While Friedrich List provided the theory, it was the Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck who executed the strategy. Bismarck famously declared that the great questions of the day would be decided by iron and blood. Yet, behind the military conquests that unified Germany in 1871 lay a highly sophisticated and often secretive apparatus of private finance. Bismarck's personal banker and close confidant, Gerson von Bleichroeder, was instrumental in this process. Bleichroeder served as the vital conduit between the Prussian state and international financial markets, ensuring the state had the liquidity required for its military campaigns, brilliantly bypassing uncooperative parliaments that refused to fund Bismarck's military expansions. After unification, the real challenge was not winning battles. It was welding dozens of semi-sovereign German states into a single fiscal and monetary organism. Taxes, customs receipts, and state debts had been fragmented. Now Berlin needed standardized coinage, a coherent imperial budget, and credibility in foreign capital markets, fast. Bleichwerder's role was less mysterious banker and more systems engineer, arranging bridge financing, coordinating bond placements, and managing the timing of payments so the state could spend today against revenues that would arrive months later. The birth of the German Empire in 1871 was immediately followed by one of the largest macroeconomic stimulus packages in modern history. Following its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, France was forced to pay Germany an unprecedented 5 billion franc indemnity. Bismarck and his financial architects leveraged this massive influx of capital to enact a monumental currency reform. The French indemnity mattered not only because it was huge, but because it arrived in a form Germany could weaponize. Large portions were paid in gold, bills of exchange, and marketable securities. The state and its allied banks converted these flows into reserves, then used them to retire older, higher-cost debts and to rationalize the empire's financial architecture. It also allowed the new empire to buy time. A credible gold-backed currency reduced the risk premium lenders demanded, effectively lowering the cost of borrowing for railways, ports, and armaments. Prior to 1871, most advanced countries based their money on a bimetallic system, requiring a fixed parity between gold and silver. Germany, however, used the French indemnity to aggressively transition to a strict gold monometallism standard, creating a stable, unified national currency, the gold mark. This currency integration drastically reduced transaction costs, unified the domestic market, and firmly embedded the new German Empire into the global financial system. Currency reform was also a political act. A gold-based mark signaled that the empire wanted to transact on the same monetary language as London. Uniform money and more predictable commercial rules made it easier for capital to scale across the new national market. This sudden influx of wealth triggered an era known as the Gründerjahre, or the Founders' Years. An explosive speculative boom swept the nation as the war indemnity washed through the economy. New joint stock companies emerged at a breakneck pace, and ordinary citizens entered the stock market for the first time. The Gründerboom, however, was not only euphoria, it was a sudden expansion of the addressable market. Railways linked coal fields to steelworks, steelworks to shipyards, and cities to new hinterlands of consumers. Founders raised capital for everything from factories to insurance companies to speculative real estate trusts. Newspapers printed share prices. Cafes became informal trading floors. Capital was poured into railways, heavy manufacturing, and real estate. However, this euphoria was unsustainable. It culminated in the Gründerkrise, the founding crisis, and global financial panic of 1873. When credit tightened, highly leveraged ventures collapsed first. While the crash wiped out many speculative firms, it paradoxically strengthened the German economy in the long run. The crisis flushed out inefficient ventures and forced a hardening of rules, accounting, and corporate governance. Surviving firms consolidated, auditors gained authority, and financiers became more disciplined about cash flow and collateral. The German state had effectively modernized its financial plumbing, readying it to absorb the technological marvels and the giant capital-hungry corporations of the late 19th century. Emerging from the 1873 crash, Germany catapulted into the Second Industrial Revolution. Unlike Britain's earlier industrialization, which relied heavily on textiles and steam, Germany's rise was defined by heavy industry, applied science, and the practical mastery of electricity and chemicals. The geographical distribution of resources heavily shaped this boom. The western and northern regions, especially the Ruhr, sat on dense seams of coal, alongside iron ore access via rail and river. It was here that industrial titans pioneered the concern, massive vertically integrated conglomerates designed to control costs, stabilize supply, and survive the brutal cyclicality of commodity markets. Take the Krupp family. They transformed a modest cast steel operation in Essen into a global armaments and steel empire. Krupp modernized production methods, pushed high-quality steel into rails, tires, and artillery, and then pursued control upstream and downstream, mines, cokeworks, rolling mills, and transport, so competitors couldn't choke them with bottlenecks. The Thyssen story follows the same logic: scale first, integration second, and relentless investment in capacity. These firms weren't just big, they were organizational innovations, internal logistics, standardized parts, managerial hierarchies, mini-states that could plan years ahead. And because steel and coal are the skeleton of everything else, dominance here meant leverage across the entire economy. But Germany's truest edge was its high-tech vanguard. The German educational system, dense networks of technical schools, polytechnics, and research universities, created a feedback loop between laboratory science and industrial application. Firms financed in-house laboratories, recruited PhDs as staff scientists, and treated patents as strategic weapons rather than academic trophies. In electrical engineering, the scientist entrepreneur Werner von Siemens built a company that turned discovery into infrastructure. Dynamos, generators, and switchgear made electricity scalable. Scalable electricity then remade factories, lighting, and transport. The point was not a single invention, it was the system: generation, transmission, and end use, all engineered to be rolled out city by city. In chemistry, the German model became even more explicit. Coal tar dyes were the first blockbuster, a product where scientific know-how mattered more than cheap labor. From dyes, the industry expanded into pharmaceuticals, photographic chemicals, and eventually fertilizers and explosives. Companies like BASF, Bayer, and Höchst competed fiercely, but they also learned to coordinate through research alliances, licensing, and, crucially, standardization of processes. To stabilize profits in volatile markets, German industries also pioneered cartels and syndicates, formal arrangements to allocate output, set minimum prices, and prevent ruinous price wars. This was not anti-competition in the modern moral sense. It was an institutional response to sectors where fixed costs were enormous and a few percentage points of price decline could bankrupt a plant. And behind all of this stood the quiet enabler, logistics. Railways and canals weren't just transport. They were an economic weapon that compressed space. Coal could move from the Ruhr to Berlin at predictable costs, or could reach blast furnaces on schedule, and finished machinery could be exported through Hamburg and Bremen with fewer delays. Standard timekeeping, standardized gauges, and standardized contracts made the network behave like a single machine. This also created a layered industrial ecosystem. Giant concern firms dominated heavy capital, but a dense Mittelstand of specialized workshops supplied precision tools, optical instruments, pumps, and machine parts. Germany's reputation for engineering wasn't only Krupp-scale steel. It was thousands of smaller firms feeding the giants with high-quality components, trained workers, and incremental innovation. By the turn of the century, the result was visible in the macro data and in the streets. Smokestacks, electrified tram lines, booming port cities, and an export machine that began to challenge Britain not by copying it, but by leapfrogging into the scientific industries of the future. To fund colossal capital-intensive projects, steel mills, electrical grids, chemical plants, Germany required a new breed of financial institution. Enter the Universal Bank. To grasp its power, contrast it with the United States and Britain. In the US, rules and geography encouraged fragmented banking, often separating commercial lending from investment banking. In Britain, deep capital markets existed, but banks tended to be more conservative about long-term industrial equity. The result? Firms frequently had to stitch together finance from multiple, less coordinated sources. German universal banks did it all. They operated nationwide branch networks, took retail deposits, extended short-term commercial credit, underwrote stock and bond issuances, and, critically, held direct equity stakes in firms they financed. That combination mattered because heavy industry doesn't grow in neat annual increments. It grows in lurches that require enormous upfront outlays. Under the leadership of figures like Georg von Siemens, Deutsche Bank, founded in 1870 by Ludwig Bamberger and Adalbert Delbrück with the goal of challenging London's financial supremacy, became the central nervous system of German industry. It financed export trade and helped build industrial champions such as BASF, Bayer, and AEG. In this system, firms moved through a coordinated financial life cycle. A young company began with working capital finance, short-term loans and bill discounting, often carried as a current account overdraft or Kontokorrentkredit. Once profitability stabilized, the Universal Bank could refinance the firm into longer-term instruments, bond issues for predictable cash flows, or equity for riskier expansion. The bank didn't simply sell securities. This also changed corporate governance. German corporations operated with a two-tier system: a management board running day-to-day operations and a supervisory board overseeing strategy. Universal banks placed representatives on supervisory boards, acting as informed monitors with direct access to balance sheets, production plans, and cash flow realities. If an electrical company needed capital for a new power station, the bank was already in the room where the investment decision was made and could underwrite the issue immediately after. Because the banks acted as underwriters, brokers, trustees, and creditors all at once, they reduced the classic frictions of finance: information asymmetry and coordination failure. Instead of hundreds of scattered shareholders trying and failing to police management, a few major banks performed concentrated oversight. This power was amplified by proxy voting, or Depotstimmrecht. Customers kept shares deposited at the bank, and banks routinely exercised those voting rights at general meetings, giving them outsized influence over mergers, dividend policy, and executive appointments. A concrete example makes the mechanism clear. Imagine a mid-sized machine builder in 1885 that wins a large railway contract. The order is profitable, but the firm must buy steel, hire workers, and expand workshop space months before the railway pays. A universal bank bridges that gap with short-term credit against invoices and inventories. Once the firm's cash flow becomes predictable, the same bank can sponsor a bond issue to finance new machinery, and later an equity issuance to fund a second plant. One relationship, multiple instruments. And universal banks didn't operate alone. Local savings banks and cooperative credit associations mobilized small household deposits across towns and rural districts. Those pools of savings flowed upward through the banking system, ultimately supporting the big Berlin bank's underwriting capacity. The empire's finance was therefore both centralized and granular, village-level saving connected to national-level industrial strategy. The legal environment reinforced the model. Corporate law and disclosure rules increasingly demanded formal prospectuses, audits, and standardized accounting for new issues. Because underwriting banks faced reputational and legal risk if a flotation failed or disclosures were misleading, they had incentives to impose discipline: conservative valuations, tighter reporting, and professional management. Just as important was macro stability. A modern economy needs a payments system and a lender of last resort. As the empire consolidated its institutions, the central bank could stabilize liquidity during panics, while the universal banks transmitted that liquidity into the real economy through their branch networks. It's no accident that contemporary analysts saw something new here. Rudolf Hilferding later described this fusion in his 1910 work, Finanzkapital. Finance capital did not merely serve industry, it began to steer it. Germany's miracle was not only factories and science, it was the architecture that turned private savings into concentrated strategic power. Explosive economic growth created severe internal political frictions. By the late 1870s, cheaper transport and global grain shipments flooded European markets with low-cost foreign wheat and rye. This threatened the economic survival of the Junkers, the conservative landed aristocracy of Eastern Prussia, who formed the traditional backbone of the army and state administration. At the same time, Germany's heavy industrialists demanded protection against cheap foreign iron and British steel. In a masterful stroke of political economy, Bismarck abandoned free trade and brokered the marriage of iron and rye. The Tariff Act of 1879 imposed import duties on both agricultural products and manufactured goods. The alliance stabilized Junker estates and shielded capital-intensive industry, but it also had a clear distributive effect. Bread prices rose, and the burden fell disproportionately on the urban working class, whose wages lagged behind the cost of living. That social pressure collided with a political threat. Industrial workers were organizing, unions were growing, and the Social Democrats were gaining votes. Bismarck tried repression, anti-socialist laws and policing, but he also understood that coercion alone would not buy legitimacy in an urban industrial society. So he pivoted to state paternalism, social insurance as a tool of nation building. Between 1883 and 1889, the empire introduced compulsory health insurance, accident insurance, and old age and disability pensions. The design was pragmatic. Benefits were tied to employment, financed by structured contributions from workers and employers, and administered through regulated funds rather than pure charity. It was risk pooling, standardized at national scale. It also forced the empire to develop modern administration, registries, contribution collection, standardized medical certification, and local insurance funds that professionalized public health governance. The immediate goal was political: neutralize radicalism by making the state a provider. The long-term effect was economic. A workforce with access to medical care, compensation for injury, and a basic old age backstop is more stable, more productive, and more willing to move to industrial cities. Germany wasn't just building factories, it was building the social machinery that kept the factory system running. By 1914, the German economic machine appeared invincible. But the outbreak of the First World War subjected this highly optimized system to stresses it was fundamentally unequipped to handle. German planners had gambled on a short war. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a grueling war of attrition. The British Royal Navy imposed a devastating blockade, severing Germany from global trade and cutting off vital imports like Chilean saltpeter, cotton, and basic foodstuffs. The first structural shock was raw materials. In August 1914, the state created the Kriegsrohstoffabteilung, War Raw Materials Department, to centralize procurement and ration scarce inputs across the entire war economy. It forced the substitution of ersatz materials, prioritized coal, steel, and nitrates for munitions, and leaned heavily on domestic chemical capacity, most notably the Haber-Bosch route to ammonia, to compensate for the loss of imported Chilean saltpeter. Administrative control came with a hidden cost: information. Central offices could allocate quotas, but they could not replicate the price signals that normally reveal scarcity and waste. Firms lobbied for priority status, ministries competed for inputs, and the economy drifted toward political allocation, where access depended on connections as much as need. As quality fell and substitutes spread, living standards eroded even before inflation showed up in official prices. In response, the military high command instituted the Hindenburg Program in 1916. This marked the transition to absolute total war, prioritizing munitions output over all else. While armament production increased, the macroeconomic distortions were fatal, pulling millions of skilled laborers out of coal mines and agricultural fields, collapsed domestic energy and food production, leading to mass starvation. By 1918, industrial production had fallen to about 57% of its 1913 value. After 1916, coordination was institutionalized through the Kriegsamt, Office of War Economy, under Wilhelm Groener, which tried to match labor, raw materials, and transport capacity to production targets. In practice, every extra shell required reassigning rail cars, coal, and workers away from civilian heating, bread production, and repairs, turning the home front into a permanent trade-off machine. Total war also required total labor discipline. The Patriotic Auxiliary Service Law of December 1916 expanded state power over manpower by obligating most able-bodied men not in uniform to work in war-relevant sectors, while also tightening controls on job switching. It was mobilization by statute, a command economy layered on top of an industrial economy that had been built for peacetime growth. To fill labor gaps, factories drew in women, older workers, and forced laborers, while wages struggled to keep up with shortages. Worker discontent surfaced in stoppages and strikes, and the state oscillated between concessions and coercion. The legitimacy problem was structural. The burdens of war were broadly shared in hunger and risk, but the visible winners were firms with contracts and elites protected from taxation. On the home front, shortages mutated into a social crisis. Rationing and price controls could not create food that no longer existed, and bottlenecks in rail transport and farm labor made distribution chaotic. The winter of 1916 to 1917, later remembered as the turnip winter, symbolized the collapse of civilian nutrition, as households substituted animal feed routes for missing staples, and public health deteriorated under hunger and overwork. But the truest architectural failure was in war finance. Terrified of alienating the wealthy elites by raising direct income taxes, the German government chose to finance the war almost entirely through debt and the printing press. The state issued massive public war loans, hoping to eventually force the defeated Allies to pay the bill. Fatally, the central bank was permitted to print unlimited fiat currency to purchase short-term government debt. This monetized the debt and unleashed massive concealed inflation. Currency in circulation exploded by 599% over the course of the war. Germany's pre-war institutions initially made mobilization efficient. Universal banks could syndicate war credits, cartels could coordinate output, and large concern firms could retool quickly. But those same linkages fused private balance sheets to state solvency. As households shifted savings into war bonds and banks accumulated government paper, defeat became a system-wide shock rather than a contained fiscal problem. By late 1918, mass starvation, soaring inflation, and glaring inequality shattered the fragile social peace Bismarck had engineered. Mutinies erupted, the Kaiser abdicated, and the German Empire fell. The German Empire's economic miracle was not a single policy or a lucky resource endowment. It was an integrated model: political unification that widened the home market, a credible currency that lowered financing costs, a science-driven industrial strategy that targeted chemicals and electrical engineering, and a banking architecture that converted dispersed household savings into concentrated long-term capital. That model explains both the speed of Germany's rise and the brittleness of its collapse. Universal banking, cartels, and vertically integrated concern firms reduced transaction costs and solved coordination problems in capital-intensive sectors. But they also concentrated decision-making and correlated risks. When conditions were stable, concentration looked like strength. Under extreme shock, blockade, mass mobilization, and fiscal overreach, concentration became a transmission belt for failure. The war didn't merely damage the economy, it rewired incentives and expectations. Millions of households were encouraged to treat war bonds as safe, patriotic savings. Banks treated government paper as liquid collateral. Firms invested in war capacity that had limited civilian value. When defeat arrived, these claims and assets didn't disappear. They became contested political promises. The post-war state inherited a debt overhang, a traumatized population, and a production structure that needed painful reconversion. From there, the path to Weimar instability was not mysterious. A weakened tax base, persistent budget deficits, reparations liabilities, and the temptation to use central bank credit created chronic monetary pressure. The hyperinflation of 1923 had multiple triggers, but its preconditions were built during 1914 to 1918. Normalization of deficit finance, blurred boundaries between the Treasury and the central bank, and a public that had learned to distrust nominal claims. Yet the legacy was not only ruin. The empire left behind a template for late industrialization. Invest in human capital, connect laboratories to factories, build financial institutions that can provide patient capital, and use the state to coordinate infrastructure and standards. The caution is equally clear. Coordination works only with credible fiscal rules, shock-absorbing external access, and political legitimacy. When those fail, the same machinery that accelerates growth can accelerate disintegration. And it reframed the European state itself. Bismarck's social insurance and the empire's administrative capacity became reference points for later welfare systems. Germany proved that modern capitalism is as much institutional design as it is markets, an insight that remains relevant whenever states try to engineer development. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the macroeconomic history of the German Empire. If you found this analysis insightful, please like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which economic history we should decode next.